Hi, your model fails to verify, and it just does it. La 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 la. Put your fingers in your ear. La la la. Coronavirus is going to kill us all. La la la. Lock down the economy. La 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 la. You can't leave your house. La la la. I'm going to shoot you if you don't do it. La 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 la. Oh my God. Oh my God. This IHME thing and maintaining the lockdowns literally beyond today. And really, folks, beyond the first 5 days they were in place, is just plain stupid. And by the time of the original 15 days had run, it was obvious to anybody who was paying attention that the effective transmission rate of this virus had rolled over. And it did so. It peaked literally on the day that these measures were announced. Now, we can try to argue why that's the case, but what you can't say, because it takes 5 to 10 days for those measures to actually do anything, that they were responsible. They clearly were not. And by the time we got to that 15 days, we knew this. Secondly, Sweden didn't do any of these things, and their transmission rate has been very stable, right around 1.5, and hasn't changed. We've got the same situation. We're all converging in the same place. All the cities and the U.S. federal government were all converging right around that 1.5 level. And we may go a little bit lower, I don't know, but it's getting down to around that 1.5 area and flattening out and just kind of staying there, okay? And, of course, we don't know what the future holds, but this is what the slope suggests, is that you're going to go to that point, and then that's where it's going to be. And Sweden is there and has been there since this began. So the idea that we should just sit on this for all eternity is obviously crazy. What's eventually will happen is we're going to get to the herd immunity point for a 1.5 R, effective R naught, which, by the way, would be about a 30%, a little more than 30% herd immunity rate. And then that would be the end of it. But, there's an interesting thing that's coming out of some of the data. There is data in Germany now that suggests that there may be 15% herd immunity already. And that would be consistent with what we're seeing, in that the actual R rate is starting to bend. It, however, bodes very poorly for the future, because you cannot maintain these lockdown procedures forever. When you drop them, if the transmission rate goes back to where it was, then you're going to have a secondary spike. And the bad news is that if it happens into the fall and winter, when you've got the flu going on, you've got those comorbidities that are going to come from that, because you could get both bugs at once. And the very last thing you need is another bug while you're trying to fight this one off. That is likely to greatly accentuate the fatality rate. That, by the way, if it occurs, is going to be right into the maw of the election. That ought to work out really well for the Donald, don't you think? Never mind that it's very difficult as a president to get reelected when you've got a destroyed economy, especially when you're the one that did the destroying. Doesn't matter whether or not people think that he's to blame for it or not. Isn't going to make any difference. Whether anybody's going to vote for him when they're walking an unemployment line I don't know. We'll see about that. I think the people who believe that this is just going to turn around and bounce immediately are more than a little crazy. So we have the IHME model, and that is what all of these governors and everybody else has set these policies on. We know it's bogus. They updated it again yesterday. And on the initialization, look, folks, you need to understand at least this much. I mean, I get it that people don't understand computer models for the most part. But look, if I start a model on today, so I update it, so today is the date of the model's run, then the things that are facts on that day have to be reflected in that model for that day in that place. So Florida, for example, does not publish exactly how many hospital beds are occupied right now for COVID patients. However, they do publish on their dashboard how many people have ever used a hospital bed for a COVID case. All right, and the IHME model that ran and was out yesterday said that the number of beds required for yesterday in Florida was twice the number that have ever been used for COVID patients in the state since the beginning of the epidemic. Well, that's obvious bullshit. Okay, I don't care. At that point, I'm done looking at their prediction. It's worthless. It is obviously a political hack. It's like the same sort of thing. You had these people say that we were going to see a foot of sea level rise from global warming by now. Okay, and this was back, and then when this whole thing started, that by the time we got to 2020, we were going to see a foot of sea level rise, and by God, by the time that we got to 2100, we were going to see 5 feet of sea level rise, and all these beaches were going to be buried, and everyone was going to be underwater. Well, that's very nice, because in 2000, I put a dock in at my house. And water in the oceans is, of course, essentially, if you know anything about the way water works, all connected things that have water in them all end up at essentially the same level. And the reason is obvious. If it's not at the same level, the water flows from one direction to the other until it is. Okay, that's just the way it works. And we have tides because the moon pulls. We have a gravitational impact. The moon pulls on the earth. And that pull causes tides, okay? So this is why we have tidal ranges. In some places they're greater, in some places lesser. But where I live, they're very much lesser. There's about a foot worth of tidal range, and you can get the prediction tables, and it's just simply based upon the where the moon is and where the tilt and the curvature is and everything. And they're fairly accurate. Very useful if you're fishing or you're going over to Crab Island because you'd like the clean water from the Gulf. You don't want the dirty water from the bay. And so, if you want to go as on an incoming tide, as you approach high tide, then it's slack and you can actually get out there and walk around and not get dragged off your feet and out into the Gulf of Mexico and eventually down towards Cuba. That would be bad. The shark will probably eat you before you get blown back in by the next reversal. Anyway, but these things are all very well understood. And when I put my dock in, I had all the pilings put in with pilocks, which are galvanized, very heavy steel plates that lock the piling in place. And I did that not because I was also worried about the effects of global warming, but because we have these things called hurricanes. And the lift that gets generated by the surge can be very extreme, and it will rip your dock right out of the sand. So the pilocks prevent that from happening. But the interesting thing is there's been they're supposed to have a foot of tidal change. Okay, in other words, we should have the water line should be up a foot from where it was. Well, it's not. So that model's trash. And if you go on the other way, it's trash. I'm not listening to anything more that model says. Now, if you reinitialize it and you start it going forward and you say, well, we're wrong, we're going to recalibrate it, then the tidal point that you use for today when you rerun the model has to be where the tidal range, the actual sea level, actually is here today. And yet this is what the IHME model does not do, and it continues to not do this. And it's very, it's hard, folks, when you have something that makes a prediction 20 years out, because you have to wait 20 years to know if it's full crap or not. But this is making predictions that are a few days out, and yet the initialization values are wrong. There's no policymaker in his right mind. Listen, you can make all the constitutional arguments about this before. There's never been a pandemic where we have quarantined well people. We've never done that before. And yet that's what we're doing. That's not legal. It's not constitutional. It is perfectly legitimate for the people of this country to decide to resist that by force if necessary. It's one thing to declare a public health emergency and say, well, if you're sick, you have to stay home. That is supportable on the basis of public health. But quarantining people who are not ill, there's no basis in the law or the Constitution for this. The Constitution hasn't been suspended. You can't suspend the Constitution because of a pandemic. It's not how it works. Okay? You're imprisoning people who committed no offense. Not only that, they can't commit an offense. They're not sick. Then we get to the other side of this, which is at least as important, and that is Fauci and Birx and all this BS about how wonderful they were during HIV. That's a load of crap. Look, if you want to stop an epidemic, and you don't really understand a whole lot about the bug because it's new, you haven't seen it before, the only way you can do it is go after vectors. That's the only way that actually is effective. And you can make a huge difference in bending the curve of how many people get infected and how bad it is if you identify and chase vectors. Well, we didn't do that here, but we knew where the vectors were, at least one of them, the big one, was nursing homes. And that's not a surprise. Nursing homes have in the United States anyway, have an utterly deplorable record, just a deplorable record when it comes to the sanitation and hygiene and things like this. And folks, I know people don't want to hear this. All right, they don't like it. And this is a very serious problem, but nobody's been willing to address this. Listen, C. diff, which is another infection that's common in both hospitals and nursing homes, it kills people all the time in those places. And yet we pay zero attention to actually getting rid of those vectors. And part of the problem is that nursing homes, by virtue of their pricing and cost models, end up employing a lot of people and make $12 an hour to staff them. And so those people, in addition to dealing with all of the patients at the nursing home, many of whom are incontinent, also have another problem in that they go out and they moonlight. Okay, so they now, if they pick up an infectious bug, they drag it into the homes of compromised seniors and give it to them. And again, this all comes back to whether or not we are practicing good infection control. Well, we're not in those environments. And yet we have the data at this point that says that in New York, the overrepresentation from population for people who have died in New York of coronavirus is 25% comprised of those people who were in nursing homes before they ended up in the hospital. Well, folks, that's an overrepresentation of 5,000% based on their population. They're part of the population. Okay, there's a little over 100,000 beds, nursing home beds in New York. Get your calculator out, take it, divide it into the population, gives you about 0.5%. So we have 25% of the people who are dying are those residents. Well, guess what? That's an overrepresentation of 50 times. That's 5,000%. Look, we know these comorbidities make you more likely to end up dead if you get coronavirus, and we know what that list is. But it is a crime of unspeakable terms to lock the entire country down because we have a bunch of people that are getting sick in nursing home environments at a crazy rate, which is jacking up both the case fatality rate and the number of cases and leading to the so-called overload that everyone is fearing. It's crazy. And yet all you have is, U.S. Labor Department, avoid gatherings in groups of more than 10 people. Do your part, slow the spread. Folks, excuse me? Look, I get it. There's a number of different things that go into the transmission of coronavirus, just like with any other virus. The transmission rate is not a fixed number. But if you really want to make a difference in terms of who dies and how many people die particularly, what you have to do is attack vectors. And you know what? This was a lesson that was known back when AIDS showed up, and nobody paid any attention to it then. We didn't close the bathhouses in San Francisco because it was politically sensitive and would have pissed off Dianne Feinstein, who was the mayor. She was afraid of losing her job. Now she's a senator. Nobody's ever paid for this. Fauci and Birx never paid for it. These same clowns are the ones that are running around saying we're going to have a vaccine. Well, there's an article out that says that it is entirely possible that many people that get infected with coronavirus build very few antibodies. That suggests, by the way, not just that they build few antibodies, but that the antibodies may not stay. In other words, your resistance to the infection, which you naturally build during the course of the infection, may not be permanent. If that turns out to be true, then all this hogwash about a vaccine is just a load of bullshit. You're never going to get a vaccine. It's never going to work because you're not going to be able to maintain the antibodies, and therefore the immunity won't stick. The idea that this is going to be some bug that we're going to vanquish and it's never going to be seen again on the face of the planet is fanciful nonsense. That has never happened. We've had 2 viruses that have been eradicated from America and the world. 2. Rhinopest is one. You've probably never heard of it, but that's because it was mostly livestock. It's not a human threat so much. And the other one everyone knows about is smallpox. But before we had a smallpox vaccine, the only way to avoid getting smallpox and being killed by it was to inoculate yourself with it on a very small dose, build an antibody reaction, and some of you would end up getting really sick and dying, and that's really sad. But the rest would be able to not worry about it anymore. And in fact, during the Revolutionary War, that was done because it was the only means to combat this. But we used to have quarantines, and we'd do all sorts of drastic things. And you know what? Every time we thought it was gone, it would come back. And between a real vaccine from cowpox, okay, we actually managed to get this one under control. There's no evidence. Smallpox, however, is not a coronavirus. All right. The reality is that coronaviruses are not new. They cause a decent percentage of both the flus and the colds in America every year. They've been around forever. There is evidence that this one may not be all that novel. It may not have shown up in January. It may have been in the United States for a year or more before that, and not just in the United States. The immunity data out of Germany is very interesting. The idea, we're starting to see some evidence that there may be 10% of the population of Germany has had coronavirus. And if that's the case, that's a stunning number, because it's an order of magnitude or more, actually considerably more than that. And that's a huge problem, folks, because if that is the case, then everything that we've done from a public health perspective is just flat out wrong. And here is the challenge with this. If it's flat out wrong, then who's accountable for that? Because if you're going to take extraordinary acts, you need extraordinary evidence. But there is no extraordinary evidence at all. It doesn't exist. Fauci and Birx can't produce it. They don't have it. They're running the same old scaremongering BS playbook that went on during the early years of AIDS. And hey, listen, AIDS, at the time, if you got HIV, you were going to die. That was 100% fatal. There were no exceptions. This bug is not really all that bad. If you don't have any one of a list of specific conditions, the odds of you falling ill and dying, actually dying, is less than 0.06%. Well, now that still means there are going to be people that die of this that don't have those conditions. But look, the majority of these conditions are things that are lifestyle decisions, okay? And secondly, they're things that if you have them, you know you have them. So if you're grossly obese and hypertensive or diabetic or both, you have cardiac disease, you have lung disease, you have liver disease, you have cancer or had cancer, you're immune compromised. These are not conditions that somebody who has these things don't know about. Of course they know about it. So why don't they isolate themselves in their own homes? Why don't they contemplate using hydroxychloroquine as a prophylaxis? It may work and it may not, but you could take it in a prophylactic dose, which has far fewer risks than taking therapeutic doses. And yet, here's these models that say that we're gonna do all these things, and yet, Donald Trump just out on Twitter right now, a key coronavirus model is now predicting far fewer deaths. That's because the American people are doing a great job, social distancing, et cetera. Keep going. That's a total load of bullshit. The IHME model said at the very top of the page that the model's assumptions were that we would have full social distancing through the end of May 2020. That's always said that. It's said that since the first run. So Trump's lying. So's Birx. So's Fauci. So are all these other people. So's UW. Folks, it is one thing to take an action based upon what you see in data on the ground that looks really frightening at the time that you see it, okay? And when you have an accelerating R value, that is scary. And for something that has a decent lethality component to it, when you see that, then there really is, all right, at that point, there really is an issue, all right? And that's not bullshit, all right? I mean, that's okay. But they literally top-ticked the market, so to speak, with this, all of them. All the governors, the United States federal government, Trump, everybody else, they literally top-ticked it. And one of the things that will destroy you as a trader or an investor is top-ticking the market, not realizing it, being stubborn, refusing to deal with the fact that you top-ticked it, or shorting into a hole, and it turns on you, and you stubbornly stick with that position because, by God, it's going to turn back down. Well, no, maybe it's not. Okay. And fairly soon you don't have a trading account anymore. Your investments are gone. They're a puff of smoke. That happens all the time to people, and you're supposed to learn something from it. So there's a very serious problem here right now, folks, in that we continue to give aid and comfort to the scaremongers. We do not have people who are willing to stand up in the political sphere and tell the screaming Karens that this stuff just is a load of BS, that there never was any support for it, that the models are wrong. They've been proved wrong sequentially. Every single one of their runs has been a fraud. Everyone. Not just, I mean, look, the first one's a mistake. You do it again, it's not a mistake anymore. And so there we are. We have this proof. It's in front of us. We understand it, and yet we're refusing to deal with it because we just won't. And so what we've done is created a crazy set of fear in Americans, in everyday ordinary Americans. People are scared to death to go to the damn store, for crying out loud. They look at you like you're death walking down the aisle. Well, people say that critical supply chains won't break. Well, they're already breaking. And more of them are going to break, and they're going to kill people. You've already got hospitals in rural areas that have been essentially shut down because of coronavirus and no elective procedures being allowed by state medical boards. And those places are closed. And even if they weren't forcibly closed, you've scared people to the point that nobody will go to the hospital unless they're dying. All right? So all those elective things that they're gone. And these hospitals are literally ghost towns right now. They are now getting furloughed. The people that work there are being laid off. How long? What's going to happen if you've got a rural hospital? Okay, and folks, this is happening right now. This is not conjecture. This is not, you're just trying to scare. No, I'm telling you what's happening today. These places are not going to hang on for more than another week or two. They are literally laying off nurses and doctors and shutting because they have no patients. There's nobody in the place. And so what happens if you are in one of those places, you live in one of those parts of the country, and you have a heart attack? What happens to you? Do you know what happens to you? You die. We have in this country 1.6 million heart attacks and strokes a year. We save an awful lot of those people. If there's no hospital within a reasonable distance, because the closest one that's open is 70 miles away up the road, you're going to die. That's a fact. You didn't need to die. You died because of the coronavirus lockdowns. You didn't die because of coronavirus. You died because you had a ordinary run-of-the-mill, people get them every day, heart attack or stroke. And we're going to start killing people, literally killing people, because these centers, these medical centers, they have no patients in them. They're businesses. If you have no money coming in, just like the local grocery store, if there was no money coming in, they'd close it. Just like the local restaurant. You had the TGI guy that runs TGI Fridays. He was on Kramer last night, and he said that even with all the takeout orders being processed and everything else, that his business is down 80%. Those places will not survive. Okay, all the overhead of having the building and everything else, you can't survive on 20% of your revenue as a restaurateur. It's impossible. I don't care how much money the government tries to hand out. It's not going to work. And then you have this. All the money in the world doesn't make produce go somewhere useful. Virtually a huge percentage, it's probably not all, but a huge percentage of the produce that's grown in Florida is literally rotting, because where that produce normally goes is restaurants. And, of course, they're all shut down, okay? The grocers that are putting produce on the shelf in your grocery store, they're getting it from overseas because it's 5 cents cheaper. That's still coming in. So all the produce here is literally rotting. Well, you can say, well, we don't need it, but it'll be okay. We'll get it next year. Really? What about the guy who grew it? He has 100% loss on his crop. What happens to him? Oh, we'll just print the money and make it up. Well, you could do that, but you cannot print the farm. You can't print things. You can't print tomatoes and cabbage and squash, zucchinis. You can't print things. You can print money, but not things. We're destroying the fabric of the country, folks. The interconnections are far more complex than anyone can understand, and we're going to start killing people within the next couple of weeks. This needs to end now. I'm your ticker guy.